Hello, everybody. Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, and we need to talk about the desperation and honestly cluelessness of the Europeans when it comes to the war in Ukraine and the unfolding political and diplomatic activities. Over the last few weeks, we have seen this diplomatic development in which the president of the United States met with Vladimir Putin in Anchorage. We have seen how then the Europeans had a very humiliating moment when they decided to join Mr. Zelensky in Washington and were treated like little school kids in front of the desk of the boss, including, of course, the NATO General Secretary, Mr. Rutte, and the entire European elite, political elite that was just sitting in Washington and was getting the drumbeat from what Donald Trump wants, what the United States wants, and what they demand that the Europeans do. And they went back to Europe and tried to sell that as a great victory for for showing that Europe still matters. Now, of course, Europe doesn't matter, not at all. The interesting thing is that the Europeans haven't understood this yet, that they seriously still believe that there is something that they can do in order to force Russia to come to end it, what they say is its war against Ukraine. And let's just go through a couple of the headlines that we are reading these days in Western media and some of the Russian media, just to understand how deep the delusions of the Europeans are at the moment. So here from Politico, we read today in on their this U.S. and Western sponsored mouthpiece that the Europeans are grasping for straws. Europe floats Ukraine Russia buffer zone in push for peace. And according to diplomatic sources familiar with the matter, and I'm not going to comment on that any further, but according to what the Politico could find out, there are now European leaders who are weighing the creation of a 40-kilometer buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian front lines as part of a peace deal. Why do I show you this? It's just an example of just how utterly ridiculous the discussion inside Europe at the moment is, where the Europeans discuss basically with each other and they do diplomacy with each other, not looking at what the Americans told them, what they are aiming for, not considering what the Russians are aiming for. So basically, just having an internal policy brainstorming about how they would like to see the war to end, of course, without having the means nor the methods to bring any of this about. It's utterly ridiculous because Russia repeatedly has rejected such kind of an idea that there would be NATO or European troops inside Ukraine. The Russians have categorically ruled such a scenario out, and not just since yesterday, but for a long, long time. The only kind of peacekeeping troops that even hypothetically could be pitched to the Russians without being laughed out of the room is some sort of neutral third party, let's say peacekeepers coming from India or from China, which is of course something that the Europeans would never ever even dream about, but they do dream about themselves sending troops, boots on the ground, disguised as peacekeepers in a buffer zone. Of course, this is the Russians will never, ever, ever say yes to this. And why should they? The one thing that has not sunk in to the brains of the people who seriously have debates about this is that that Ukraine and that the collective West, that NATO, basically already has lost this war. Viktor Orban said so much. He knows and he understands. But the people in Brussels and the NATO leadership still, for some reason, either still wants to pretend toward the population in Europe that this war is not lost, or they seriously have fallen for their own propaganda, which is why they then come up with this kind of nonsense, right? Which is just I mean, it could be just kabuki theater, right? It could just be a make-believe of the Europeans constantly trying to messaging to their own populations that they're working on it and that they're serious. But that it is, of course, the Russians that are blocking all and any proposals, even if you even if you come up with proposals that they have already from the beginning rejected, right? So why would you even start with that? It's just a rehashing of a narrative of European agency, maybe we can put it this way, in a conflict in which they really are puppets at worst and maybe bystanders at best, right? I mean, at this point, the entire European political apparatus, the Germans, the French, the Italians, the European NATO members, they are really, at best, they just stand there and take whatever the orders are from Washington, because we know that you completely, utterly depend on Washington, which is why you had all of these leaders. You had Meloni, you had Merz, you had Macron, accompanying Mr. Zelensky to Washington, because they know the decision makers are in Washington, and Vladimir Putin knows that just as well, which is why he actually went and had a tete-a-tete with the decision leader. Now they are still dreaming of such initiatives here, and these are long articles in which, though even Politico calls them grasping for straws. Um, it of course also has to do with probably the indignation of the Europeans that they don't matter anymore. And last night, we had a large attack by Russia at the capital, Kiev, in which also the offices of some offices of the European Union, of the delegation there, were harmed. And of course, this is outraging the Europeans. And these U.S. ambassadors, the EU ambassadors, the EU diplomats, they are now calling even louder for U.S. help, not realizing how desperate it keeps sounding. That you have simply run out of options militarily, you have run out of options politically, your own. There is no more agency left. What is left is for Europe to beg at the door of Washington. The ridiculous thing is, of course, that Washington also understands that it lost the proxy war with Russia. And while the US seems to be in a process trying to figure out how to extricate itself from this mess, and don't get me wrong, we do have discrepancies inside the United States. We know that Lindsey Graham would still want to double down on the sanction issue and would like to punish third states heavily, while Donald Trump is a bit more cautious on this, although not nearly enough. And we have discrepancies in what Washington's the political process in Washington says what should happen next. But the Europeans, at this point, they're now begging at the doorsteps of the US, and they understand that they are beggars, right? So here we have in Politico again this admission that from Katarina Matrenova, the EU's top diplomat in Kiev, who said on Thursday that the assault flies in the face of Moscow's official line that it is open to negotiations and an end to the conflict. No, Mrs. Matrenova, what this means is just that you never listened to the Russians, to what they're saying. They said they are willing to continue to do negotiations with Ukraine, which they're, by the way, doing under the Istanbul format, but that they will not stop the special military operation, because they have said time and again, it would be just a trap for them to stop advancing militarily, and they are winning the war. At this point, they are winning the war. They are able to assert and gain what they want on the battlefield. So the question to the Russians is not how to get peace at any price. The question is how to get the peace that you want, through which method. And they currently have two methods available, one military, the other one diplomatic. And if the diplomatic track doesn't work, they will continue with the military track. And this is what the Europeans are not listening to. So if you want to stop the bloodshed and the attacks from Russia, what needs to be done is an offer to Russia that they are willing to accept. And the Russians have said time and again, it's the terms of June 2024 in the speech that Mr. Putin gave to the foreign ministry. They want a neutral Ukraine, so no NATO troops, no buffer zone. They want a demilitarized Ukraine, demilitarized to a point where no more threat would emit from there, and they need some sort of political solution, grand solution for the European continent, a security structure. And if the Europeans ever get around to actually discuss those terms with the Russians, then there is a chance of stopping this war. And until that is the case, the Russians have made it clear that they will continue the military arm of their strategy. So the Europeans keep, of course, ignoring this. They just never talk about it. That's why we then have this type of nonsense where this Matranova added that the EU and the US need to work together to pressure the Kremlin to sit down at the negotiating table in a transatlantic way, calling for joint sanctions to squeeze Russia's economy and empty Putin's war chest. And I need to interject again, ladies and gentlemen. We are now 3.5 years into this special military operation. We are 3.5 years into this war, into this terrible bloodletting of both Ukrainian and Russians in Ukraine, a completely preventable conflict, as the Europeans from the beginning said, like, fine, you know what, Ukraine needs to remain neutral and we need to have a stable security arrangement. But that was never the approach. The Europeans went along with NATO neocons in pushing Ukraine over the edge and into the bayonets of the Russians. And they are continuing to do so because they are never willing to actually listen to what the Russians are telling them. So, but at this point, it gets even more ridiculous after 3.5 years, because now, at the beginning, the Europeans at least had the hope and the justified expectation that their sanctions might work, right? And they had toolkits, right? And they had different ideas what to implement. And at the beginning, at least, the expectation that some of these approaches would work was not unjustified. Let's put it that way. Especially for people who looked at Russia as a gas station masquerading as a country. But by now, after 3.5 years, and after 18 sanctions packages, which have neither resulted in the collapse of the Russian economy, nor in a collapse of the Russian political leadership, nor have they taken away the means of implementation for the Russians to be able to wage this war. None of this has happened in 3.5 years, and they are still, to this day, talking and about emptying Russia's Putin's war chest. These people either don't understand or are just willingly lying to the European population that about the way that this war works. Russia is a large country with a large economy, internal economy, and it has all it needs, from rare earths to iron ore, to the human resources, to the know-how and technical expertise to produce weapons themselves. They can produce drones, they can produce weapons, they can produce shells, they can produce tanks, they can produce missiles, they can produce airplanes. They do that with what they've got inside their large territory. It's not a question of a war chest. War chest is such a dumb and stupid concept. It's not about the money. You unwilling or unable technocrats in Brussels. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit worked up. It's just after 3.5 years of the continuous same nonsense without any kind of added, at least addition to what we've been told, it gets really, really hard to not lose yourself. Europe, it's not about the war chest. It's about the real economy, the Russian real economy, the possibilities the Russians have inside their country to produce war materials is not limitless, but it's vast. It's vastly larger than the ability of the NATO countries combined in producing weapon systems. Otherwise, the weapons in Ukraine wouldn't be running out. Otherwise, you would have options in order to supply Ukraine with military equipment and military gear to win over the Russians. That was the whole point. That was the whole idea in the beginning of the proxy war. Let's have the big showdown, right? Instead of a negotiated end back in March and April of 2022, and a neutrality agreement, the way that it was hammered out in Istanbul, instead of that, let's do the showdown and let's show Vladimir Putin who has got more military might. And that didn't work. The Russians outproduced the Europeans, and they have still not noticed it. It's absolutely fantastic that, sideline commentators like me, who are not even close to any of these battlefields, who are not even close to being military experts, um, can understand more about how this entire grand scheme of the war is working out than the people who do this professionally, at least in their speech acts. Again, there's always the chance that this Mrs. Matrenova actually understands perfectly what's happening, but that she's just lying, that she just lies to people. She also says that, I think that any sanctions work better if they come from different parts of the democratic world. The move by the EU to include the shadow fleet, expand the listings, etc., I think actually is biting, but we need to keep at it. She, seriously, after 3.5 years of not being able to cripple the Russian economy, thinks that the sanctions are actually biting. We don't know about it. We have no actual numbers that prove that. The numbers actually say the opposite. The numbers say the Russian economy is growing, but if we believe it strong enough, if we tell ourselves strong enough that it's working, then it's working. Because reality depends on what we Europeans wish it to be. It is pretty much a very sad ending to a continent that once was able to do geopolitics and realism, and the continent, of Machiavelli and others. And not that I'm proud of what they did, it's just there was more realism, there was more understanding of how the world worked than what we are seeing right now. Again, we are at sanction package number 19. Sanction package 19. And the people who've given you 18 sanctions package believe that the 19th sanction package will work. We leave out the point that in the old sanctions package, they're already starting to also use these packages against their own people, that we have German citizens, EU citizens, that are now targeted with sanction packages, not just the war to the outside. We're seeing how this system is now starting to turn inward. We also need to be pointed out that, of course, the idea of the Europeans is that the extremist wing of the US that wants to sanction third countries is actually right. The Europeans believe that that's the way forward. So this article here actually talks very positively about the fact that now India was slapped with 50% tariffs as a punishment for buying Russian oil, and then that there's other people like Lindsey Graham who would like to increase these sanctions to 500%. So basically threaten India with cutting them off of the entire US market if they don't play ball with the ideas of the neocons, which is to completely stop all trade with the Russians. And the Europeans would most likely welcome such an approach, and they're now thinking themselves about sanctions on third states. And this is, in my view, on the one hand, a very natural thing to happen during conflicts, that you start hammering the neutrals. Neutrals always get hammered because neutrals are always accused of not supporting the war effort of the war parties enough, right? Therefore, they contribute to evil. It's this black and white thinking, right? If you're not on our side, you're with evil, and so it's a natural thing to happen that third parties get hammered. But of course, this is also a sign of desperation. You wouldn't need to do that if you were on the winning side, and if the Russians were retreating, and if the Moscow was about to politically collapse, and everything was working out in the favor of the neocons. Then you could just overlook those things. And what usually then would happen is that later on, a couple of years later, you come up with historical commissions that find out how poorly the neutrals behaved. And that would be the route to go if they were winning. But since they're losing now, they try to double down not only on the primary target but the secondary targets, like the neutrals. Very, very predictably, this is angering India, and this is alienating India. Now that these 50% tariffs are actually taking effect, the Indian economy will suffer from this, and that's the entire idea, right? You cause strain and suffering in third countries, but India is actually standing its ground. saying not only that it is perplexed about the US stance on Russian oil imports, but that it is not thinking about changing that approach. And the Indian Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, has made it clear many times ever since 2022 that it makes no sense for India to adjust its foreign policy based on the wishes of Europe and the United States, because Indian foreign policy should serve the interests of India, and India has a decent relationship with Russia. Therefore, India will do what is in its own best interest. What Mr. Jaishankar on this little press conference here recently with Foreign Minister Lavrov also says is that, and it's even more ununderstandable for the Indians that this policy is coming now, since they were told explicitly by also the Americans of the previous administration to buy Russian oil in order to stabilize the oil price on world markets, and that the fact also that other third states also still buy Russian products and Russian oil, and that it is India that's being singled out for one reason or another. And of course, we cannot tell whether this is because of some wimp of Donald Trump or if there is a greater strategy behind it. I heavily doubt it. The only thing we can tell for sure is that this just adds injury to insult from these tariffs that Donald Trump just slapped around on everybody, more or less. That now India is being singled out for even more tariffs for very specific foreign policy that it has. So the tariffs and sanctions are now basically just two flavors of the same foreign policy weapon that the US and the European Union are using, not only on target states, on enemy states, but also on third states. This is an escalation for the US, but it is especially also an escalation for the European Union, which used not to do secondary sanctions. But now they've started, and they are in their desperation now trying to put even more pressure on implementing secondary sanctions. But as always, they don't want to do it alone. They want Daddy US, Daddy Washington to lead the way in also in sanctioning other countries in these tariffs. So, and this will lead, as night follows day, as Alexander Mercury often says, as night follows day, and this will lead to more cooperation between India inside the BRICS with China, with Russia, with alternatives. And the Indians are actually saying at the moment that they need to build more reliance, and that they should buy more local products, and that they should try to be self-sufficient as far as possible. No country ever is completely self-sufficient, but India has its own potential market of 1.4 billion people. Of course, the purchasing power of India is incomparably lower than the purchasing power of the United States of these consumers. But in terms of creating a grand strategy and getting everybody in the country in all different parties on the same page, it is pretty clear that India needs to work on self-reliance and on partnerships, multilateral partnerships towards the global south, and that's exactly what's going to happen. And India actually has the guts to stand up for its economy and its own rights, unlike the Europeans, who immediately ran to Washington, and which took a very, very bad deal. Ursula von der Leyen took a very bad deal with Donald Trump. Even the Swiss, when they were slapped with 39% tariffs, they rushed to Washington immediately to beg for tariff relief. And of course, the United States, especially under the administration of Donald Trump, will try to suck everybody else dry, because that's how they see the world. And honestly, the Europeans, including the Swiss, have no leverage. They just simply have they've lost all leverage, and they lost all chances at building more relationships with other powers. You don't have alternatives. And the Indians now understand, just like most of the global south, that alternatives is what you need to build. Now, at the same time as this is going on, the Germans in Europe, the Germans are now thinking about a slow creeping forward of reintroducing mandatory military service. They still say that this is not on the cards and that they wouldn't go that far. But what we are reading from the deliberations of the current Merz government, everything is going toward that route, that the Germans, not only them, but the Europeans in general, want to build up military capacity, and first and foremost with the military personnel that they have available. This is again bad news in my view, because it is exactly the wrong kind of internal approach toward this external insecurity. So instead of sitting down with the Russians, instead of trying to hammer out a all European or a Eurasian security structure, what the Europeans are doing is trying to just increase the military capabilities of each one of them. This will first and foremost take, of course, about a decade or more. And secondly, it is only going to gear up Europe for more, not less, conflict. So what we are seeing is this militarization and the militarization of the mindset of the Europeans at the moment. At the same time, of course, the same people who increased and are happy about an increase of the GDP, 5% of GDP spending for NATO, for defense, that was recently agreed to in the latest NATO summit. And this increase in military spending, and there's always money for the military. At the same time, the same people who will tell you that they will invest whatever kind of sums it takes into their militaries, they will also tell you that they do not have money for the welfare of people. So Mr. Merz, while saying that Germany needs more troops and needs more military capabilities, and pledges 5% of its GDP to military spending, says in an interview that the welfare state can no longer be financed. It's not that Mr. Merz doesn't want the welfare state. He loves the welfare state, but it's just too expensive. There just ain't no money. And again, just as with the Russian nonsense about draining the war chest, this too is a nonsense narrative. There always is money. There always are ways of financing. It's a question of political will, whether you want to support the weakest of your society, or whether you have a strategic interest in, letting certain parts of your population go to waste. Because if you do that, if you drain the money from one sector in the economy and you make sure people have no more money, and you pump money into another sector, the military sector, well, where are these people going to go? Well, they're going to go to where the money is. And that's how you funnel people into the military industrial complex. This is how you create the cannon fodder of tomorrow. So the Germans are now actively working on cannon fodder production, because you need the impoverishment of one part of the population that then can be sent to the trenches. Because at the end of the day, you still need people willing to take up a rifle and march and run yelling against an enemy who will probably kill you, but you still do it anyhow for some reasons. And one of these reasons is that it is the last paying jobs in your country. So this is the sad reality to me at the moment, that this is going on in front of our eyes, the remilitarization of Europe, but not the smart remilitarization, not the kind of let's build our strategic infrastructure, not the kind of let's think about how to create security on the continent, but just how to get people to then fight the wars that we want, because they're now realizing the Americans are not fighting wars anymore how the Europeans like it. So they are kind of now in a scramble for an approach, but they have not lost the colonial mindset. They haven't lost the idea that all you need is enough political leverage over others in order to bend them to your will. At the moment, of course, this is being turned inward. It's turned inward to the European Union, and you punish dissent. You punish people at the lower end of the economic ladder, thereby securing future cannon fodder. maybe the last slide I have is this Politico article that EU leaders are open their arms to Moldova, denouncing Putin's lies. I found this quite interesting. Let's end on this one. That of course the EU, while decrying Russian meddling in foreign affairs, they have no shame, no shame at all to meddle themselves in the affairs of third states. Moldova is under attack. We've seen how Georgia was under attack, and how the EU tried to intervene very heavily into the political process that was around December last year in Georgia. There it didn't succeed, but they still have their eyes, their sights on others. Moldova, of course, today having an article in their constitution that declares them neutral for very good reasons, for the exact same reasons that Ukraine had this neutrality article, because it is a border state with Russia, and if Moldova ever becomes a military threat to the Russians, just as with Ukraine and with Georgia, the Russians will intervene. They will make sure that they are not threatened from their near abroad. But naturally, the Europeans haven't learned anything, or again, they want to double down on the already failed policies of the past. So Mr. Merz, together with Mr. Macron of France and the leader of Poland, Mr. Tusk, they went to Moldova and had a show of force here. I'll show you the picture. The von der Leyen as well, by the way, she also went to Moldova. You must know Moldova is of course not an EU member state, but the prospect of EU membership is being dangled in front of the Moldovans as a little carrot to say, like, look, you just need to follow the right policies, which are anti-Russian policies. They say so outright, right? It's like you must follow our pro-European policies. They call that, of course, democratic policies. Never mind what recently happened in Romanian elections. Never mind that inside European states we have discussions about banning parties. That that the largest opposition party in Germany is now being surveilled by Germany's intelligence agencies. Never mind that there are all of these cases also in France against the Front National, and that we have very clear democratic backsliding in the EU itself, that we also have the EU Commission sanctioning EU citizens with draconian consequences for these EU citizens. Never mind all of that. As long as you, as a third state, follow the instructions of this technocratic leadership of the EU, of these different so-called leaders, then you will be shown a little carrot, right? And for Moldova, the little carrot is EU membership in the future. And they say outright, just I highlighted a few passages of what Friedrich Merz said. The door to the European Union is open, and you're wholeheartedly welcome in the European Union. And Macron and Tusk, they doubled down, saying that both said that Moldova's future lay within the 27-nation bloc rather than in Moscow's sphere of influence. Implicitly, of course, implying that the EU is the sphere of influence of the Central Europeans, right? That the Moldova should be in their sphere of influence and in the Western sphere of influence, and not in the Russian sphere of influence. So the zero-sum thinking is not at all over, and the audacity of the Europeans, of course, of calling any kind of political statements toward Moldova coming from Russia as meddling, while they themselves go to Moldova and while they themselves push and support the pro-EU leader, they don't see that as meddling. They see that as democratic support. Mr. Macron also said that unlike Russia, the European Union threatens no one and respects the sovereignty of all. The European Union is in no way the Soviet Union. And again, if they say that, if they make that pronouncement, what it means is that in their mind, they already understood that that's the way they're going. they already understood that they now need to deny the obvious in order to still convince a couple of people that there's nothing fishy going on. The EU is becoming more draconian by each month. The sanctions that are now turned against EU citizens is an example of that. The fact that Russian media is banned from the EU is part of that. The this kind of dialing down and scaling back the freedom of speech inside the European Union is part of that. And they also understand it. So they deny the very thing that they're working on in order then to still keep up the good messaging toward third states, in this case, Moldova. The it's really quite astonishing. And the reason for the visit, of course, is that Moldova will have parliamentary elections on September 28th, and that this is supposed to kind of boost Maya Sandu. Here she is in the middle, right, of this picture, Maya Sandu, flanked by Ursula von der Leyen and the who's the other guy? Oh yeah, the 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 supporter, the number two. Actually, I need to look up. I need to look up who he is. I'm sorry, but flanked by the European Union. That if you behave, you have a chance at EU membership. The funny thing is, of course, that the European Union is saying that for 2 years, since 2023, that Moldova can have candidate status and that we can start negotiations. They haven't started negotiations for 2 years because the carrot is nothing that should ever be really given, right? And until the end, you need to have the carrot in front of the donkey in order to make the donkey move. The problem that the EU has is, of course, that Maya Sandu only represents one part of the country and that there are various opinions. And she's actually not the most popular leader. And it also completely ignores that there's an entire strip of Moldova that is not under the actual control, the political control of the central government of Moldova, but that there is Transnistria, which is a breakaway region. And there is this kind of fragile, Moldova is a fragile state in this sense, but and has internal problems and internal strife by, of course, that having the carrot of the European Union in front of them is supposed to help Sandu, but it's also this messaging, right? That if you get into the EU, you get into the club of the good democracies only if you vote correctly. If you should dare, Moldova, not to vote for Ms. Sandu's party, if Ms. Sandu's party loses her majority in parliament, then you will be punished. Then the carrot will be withdrawn, and the stick might come out the way that the stick came out toward the Georgians. And that's the EU's understanding of a high-level foreign policy, right? This is the best the EU can do in terms of coercing the near abroad to its will. And it's, of course, it's not only hypocritical, it's also going to backfire. This type of behavior will not fly quite well with a lot of the Moldovans. And we know from the past election that Moldova, the last result, pro-Sandu result, came in thanks to the Moldovan diaspora in the rest of the EU, while the diaspora in Russia had a hard time of voting. But anyhow, like Moldova is this kind of this place that the EU now conceptualizes as another battleground state instead of conceptualizing Moldova as a neutral place that should be handled with care, like a fragile raw egg, in order not to break it between between the Russians and NATO. But they do the exact opposite. They try to break another egg. It's not enough to have broken already the big egg of Ukraine. You want to continue that failed policy because, again, the Europeans do not learn from past mistakes. 19th sanction package really screams at you. We haven't learned a thing. This is where we are in European politics as of late August 29th, 2025. We will see how this develops, but unless there is serious change in the leadership of the European Union, we should not expect of any kind of learning process to take place. Learning will not happen from these people. The only change in the European continent will come if there is a political dynamic that will sweep away these people and replace them with brains that have more sense for realism and for what is actually feasible. Thank you very much for your attention.